Ladies and gentlemen, you might have noticed that speaking of the virus, we first addressed the context of what cybersecurity is most closely associated with, namely the digital tools. With them by now discussed, let us now pass on to investigating our reality and a panel on how the virus is affecting the critical sectors of our economy. The subject will be tackled by Melissa Hathaway, President of Hathaway Global Strategies LLC, cybersecurity advisor in George W. Bush and Barack Obama administrations, and expert of the Kosciuszko Institute, of course, Tomasz Zdzikot, president of the management board at Poczta Polska S.A., Michael Bem, executive director and chief information security officer at UBS, Evangelos Ouzounis, head for secure infrastructure and services at ENISA, and Marco Alexander Breit, head of the Artificial Intelligence Task Force in the German Federal Ministry for Economic Affairs and Energy, and Samuel Stolton, digital editor at EURACTIV, who will make sure that the discussion runs smoothly.
Fantastic, thanks so much. And apologies for those technical glitches. These things can obviously often happen in the world of cyber, but as we're becoming more resilient, hopefully these types of technologies can become better and better. Marco, I wanted to turn to you first. And when we're talking about the ICT solutions that have become more commonplace over the past few months, we've seen telemedicine and mobile networks becoming vital sources of support for traditional critical infrastructure and the supply chains built around it. I wonder if you believe that this could be the right time to define Europe's critical sectors, and if so, which areas could be expanded?
Yes, thank you, Sam. I think the answer is twofold. First and foremost, we actually see, and as you mentioned, for example, in health services or in governmental services or in the broader industry, that especially our endpoint security is highly at risk right now. I think you have seen the news today that the United States and the United Kingdom health services have been attacked, and there has been a case in Germany 2 weeks ago. So I think we are actually seeing that cybersecurity is no longer nice to have. It's actually essential if you want to make your business run, if you want to make your organizations run steady, and that they are able to fulfill their duties. So I think we all know by now that cloud infrastructure, for example, microelectronics, 5G and 6G, and obviously cybersecurity is something that we need to address from the European level and that we need to address on the nation state level too. And it's probably something that we need to address from the company level too. And I personally think if there is one kind of company we are lacking right now in Europe, then it's a cloud-based AI-enhanced endpoint cybersecurity firm. But this is something that you can address strategically right now. But on the other hand, there is some specific sectors that are vital for member states, for example, smaller member states, and they are critical for the economy to function. And this is something that is usually not addressed when we are talking about critical infrastructure and critical technologies and critical services. This is, for example, travel. If you take Southern Europe into account, if travel is not working, their economies are at risk. And cybersecurity is like fine for them, but it doesn't help them at all economy-wise when they go down because there's no travel happening and tourism's down. So I think the answer is twofold. We need to address strategically these base technologies like microelectronics, 5G, 6G, cloud, and cybersecurity. But on the other hand, let's not get completely overwhelmed by this momentum. Take into account the needs of smaller member states, because from their point of view, what we are talking about here is something that's essential, but they have more essential things to worry about right now.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, and we'll get on to the 5G aspect of the current debate in Europe a bit later on, and maybe we can touch more on Europe's bid to make more progress in the cloud infrastructure space as well. I wanted to turn to Evangelos here, just in our reflections on how Europe has dealt with the various cyber threats that have emerged over the past few months. Evangelos, perhaps you could give us an insight from your position working for the EU Cybersecurity Agency, ENISA, in terms of the cyber threats that we saw to critical infrastructure during the pandemic, and what lessons can be learned in bolstering our standards for the future. And in your response, you could give us an insight into the current discussions with the European Commission on the forthcoming review of the NIS directive, and whether we could see maybe a potential widening in the scope of operators of essential services, for example.
Yes, indeed. So what we have seen, it's basically a pandemic, which is has a health-related problematic that has affected basically many sectors. Because of the lockdown of the economy, we had to return back home, and many people, started, teleworking. So that has actually shifted many processes, many operations to be online. Some companies were, very well prepared, and they managed very quickly to shift their personnel, to home, and they allowed, telework in a very sophisticated and efficient way. Others, had difficulties. So what we saw was an increasing demand for telecom services for bandwidth. And in a lot of countries, they coped very well. They had to adjust. They had to offer, additional, network capacity. And the telecom operators also and telecom regulators involved, to make sure that, there is no shortage, there are no problems. So that was one of the issues: resilience, elasticity of the telecom networks. The second thing that we saw was actually a lot of attacks, to citizens, because they were very curious to know what was happening. They were very anxious about, the topic. There were many mails, many posts, in the news. So that was actually the excellent environment for phishing attacks. And there were a lot of phishing attacks actually targeting usually end users, citizens, and also companies, so corporate personnel that, were actually using, they were targets of such attacks. And there were, at least in Europe, a couple of cases, where some very unethical attacks happened, to some hospitals, which we found this, really unethical. These hospitals were struggling, to deal with an enormous challenge, and at the same time, they were on their knees, for a couple of weeks because of a very stupid cyber attack. So overall, we are happy how the critical infrastructures in Europe coped with the phenomenon, and I think we are better prepared now. But still, we ENISA observe, relate, and talk to the people. There was, of course, a lot of fake news, misinformation that we have observed as well. But okay, this is part of the problematic, and we've noticed that as well. But there were no serious, outages, serious problems, serious attacks affecting, critical infrastructures. The ordinary attacks that we see, were more or less the case. Now, regarding the NIS directive and the involvement and the evolution of it, indeed, we now summarize 3-4 years of, policy implementation in Europe on cyber security matters. The European Commission has an obligation to do an impact assessment, a review of the directive, and we are going to do this. We are helping them as a technical body of the EU, and many ideas are being discussed. So obviously the first policy intervention was a directive, so the member states had a certain flexibility to implement, and that has resulted in some fragmentation, in some, different ways of implementing details, and we hope that in the next round we are going to address this. There are some issues also, for example, with the digital service providers, namely the cloud providers, that they were in a different modus operandi, and there are some issues with identification of them. Also, we'll try to understand the lessons learned for reporting obligations and for the identification of the OAS. So all these challenges and problems that have been identified, for the first round of the NIS are going to be discussed and evaluated, and I hope that soon the Commission will come up with something, more targeted, more focused. And there is, of course, the probability of increasing, the scope, adding more sectors, or considering other, types of service providers in the value chain. Back to you, Samuel.
That's very interesting, particularly the points you made there on fragmentation and maybe the importance of attribution retrospectively after these attacks have happened. And I just want to take this opportunity to bring in Melissa here, because Melissa, you've adopted quite a critical approach to how Europe ensures its cybersecurity, particularly on a geopolitical context. And the resilience of critical infrastructure is, of course, much needed, not only in times of crisis, but especially in the long term, generally. But how can it really be achieved? And in your opinion, what are some of the best practices of the industry and examples of public and private sector cooperation, which could be useful to Europe in the future?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that few of our countries are really putting the investments that are required for their critical infrastructures. And while we talk about resilience and we're trying to move forward with encouraging our businesses to be resilient to attacks, we're taking a regulatory approach as opposed to an incentives and an investment approach, which means in many ways, I think that we're not serious. And so when you start to look at, and just in this calendar year during the time of COVID, we've had a 715% increase in ransomware attacks against our critical businesses. That is knocking them offline. We've seen 151% increase in distributed denial of service attacks, bringing down our telecommunications providers, our content service providers, the backbone of what all of our businesses are requiring. And we've seen a 600% increase in attacks on the Internet of Things. And so we have to, at the end of the day, really start to diagnose the core problems in our infrastructure. And some of the core problems in our infrastructure is that it's been built on commercially available software and hardware that fields their product with the principle of fixing it later. And it's inherently vulnerable at the point of entry into our infrastructure. So these distributed denial of service attacks and these ransomware attacks are taking advantage of the vulnerabilities in Microsoft, the vulnerabilities in Cisco, the vulnerabilities in Citrix, and I could go on and on about the different vulnerabilities and their patching cadence. But we've had more than 1,000 patches this calendar year to Microsoft systems. We've had more than 1,000 on Oracle systems. We've had hundreds on Cisco systems, and they're all considered critical. And so we've almost misdiagnosed what's critical. We need to get the hardware and software actually fielded with well-engineered products with few vulnerabilities so that all of our critical infrastructures are not inherently vulnerable. So when we get to some of the best practices, when you start to look at what, and our previous panel talked to, South Korea actually is investing in some of their infrastructures. They've done a very large infusion of capital. I also think that there is a tax incentives that are being put forward in Japan to allow for their companies to field a more secure 5G infrastructure. There's a bilateral agreement between the United States and Japan on the joint development of those technologies. The US, UK, Ireland just signed an agreement on how do we move forward with AI or artificial intelligence technologies in a more secure and resilient way. So we really need to invest from a research and development perspective. We need to invest and help these critical industries offset the costs of becoming more resilient. And we need to have a much better conversation about 5G and the incorporation of the Internet of Things, the industrial Internet of Things, the Internet of Medical Things, and ensure that we're not making our society even more vulnerable to common attacks to these systems, which is what I fear is happening. The 600% increase, I imagine, will be 1,200% increase before the end of the year as we lace all of our critical businesses and infrastructures with vulnerable product at its core. I'll stop there, Samuel. I'm happy to take more questions. Thank you.
Definitely. Well, some very troubling statistics there, and the 5G one in particular is rife with geopolitical implications that hopefully we can come back to a bit later on. I just wanted to pick up Melissa's point about vulnerabilities. And Michael, do you think a certain extent of these vulnerabilities have almost been self-imposed? I mean, over the past few months, many millions across Europe are continuing to work remotely as a result of the pandemic. And what are the new difficulties for the public and private sector in continuing to work from home? And maybe you could tell us a bit more about the safeguards your company has put into place to ensure that employees are well versed in cybersecurity formalities, because it seems to me like we had a rather rapid transition into the remote working, home working environment, and whether or not there were cybersecurity assurances in place was something that not everyone had considered at the time. Maybe you could give us a bit of an insight into that, Michael.
Thank you for asking the question, Samuel, and happy to be here. No, absolutely. Look, I think that the perception, depending on the company or the representative of an entity that you speak to, obviously speaking to UBS, I think it's safe to say that we've made a few big bets on technology, particularly around virtual quite a few years ago, and predates COVID. And actually this put us in a different space because it facilitated remote working sort of by definition, and changed sort of the way we look at risk, particularly around data access, where data is stored and how then it's secured in storage and transit. And this basically also meant that at the point in time when this decision has been made, sort of shifting away from the traditional concept where people are being given systems that they take with home or so it became immediately apparent that staying cyber safe almost needs to be embedded and integrated within the corporate structure and culture, right? And to that effect, CISA organization has been running an education awareness campaign that's composed of a lot of different modules. Some of them are sort of more, communicating the current trends and risks and ensuring that people stay up to date, and those are very generic in the sense that they just basically reiterate the same messages on how to carry out work-related duties in the most secure possible fashion. And I suppose, just taking all of this and putting it into perspective in COVID and the question you asked yesterday, and some of the messages that I heard were there many companies needed to spin up their infrastructure and facilitate remote working almost actually overnight, and obviously this never gives you the opportunity that you need and the time in order to prepare and ensure that the control needs to be. So from that perspective, I think we were very privileged and lucky in the sense that for us it became the question of how do we scale towards meeting the current demand that's obviously spawned by the COVID crisis and the push for everybody to work from home, rather than a solution from scratch. But obviously this it's not to say that it didn't bring any challenges, because there, as you can imagine, there's also a lot of business processes that require a certain level of security, and this means that they have history premises, given facing the situation where human life obviously is the key value that we strive to protect, we need to really think hard and challenge ourselves on whether we can still continue and allow those services, office environment, so to speak, particularly places like clean rooms, or whether there's an opportunity and staff, particularly around, again, the high privilege access, administrative access, and access to client data can be carried out from the premises of from our users' home offices. So obviously this meant some more focus on detective and protective controls, elevating some of them, implement break glass processes around sort of singular access or specific duty rather than having them all the time. And again, really taking a hard look at our entitlement management processes. So we determined particular toxic combinations that weren't by the fact that people are working from.
Yeah, we're starting to lose you, actually, Michael. Maybe you could check your connection in a moment. We're starting to lose your connection there. So I just wanted to turn to Tomasz. Maybe we can return to you in a moment after your connection was a bit weak there. Tomasz, it appears to me like we've got two narratives at play here. We've got the EU trying to pursue with rather rapidity its digital transition, which means investing in certain key enabling technologies. But then we've also got not a counter narrative, but a parallel narrative, which is about Europe ensuring that it remains cyber secure. Do you think that the pandemic has highlighted which technologies in particular have become important to ensure the long-term resilience of our critical sectors? And specifically, what would those technologies be, in your opinion, Tomasz?
Thank you, Samuel. Thank you for the question. I guess it might be obvious for all the participants of the conference that the world around us has changed in a few months, but it is good to underline that, especially that from our point of view, from the point of view of the postal service, these are not only words. We can then talk and speak about numbers that shows how the world changed. Actually, how the conference is being organized, and the beginning of our panel with some technical issues shows how much do we depend on technologies, of course. But talking about numbers, first of all, we are the Polish Post, so we have a 5 centuries history of dealing with security of correspondence, of exchange of information. And we are the largest employer, 80,000 people on board with the network of more than 7,000 offices across the country. But during the epidemic, it occurred that people actually don't want to go to any office. I want to have my supplies, my items delivered to home. So the e-commerce is really boosting. In 2019, it was estimated that the Polish market is valued at about 12 billion euros. Now, the analysts say that it will double in upcoming months. Then the second trend that we have seen for last couple of years with e-substitution, so exchanging, replacing traditional correspondence with its electronic form. It was estimated that traditional letters will be sent. There will be less of them at about 8 to 10% annually. Now, comparing to the first part of 2019, we see that there is a decrease estimated at approximately 22%. So there is 22% letters less sent by the citizens, by administration, by the companies. So it is extremely important for all the post offices, for all the organizations to be a part of the digital revolution that we are observing right now. And especially that together with that goes what was mentioned before, the trend of remote work. So if we have 80,000 employees, and 7.5 thousand of offices across the country, almost every change, almost every implementation, especially connected with IT or ICT solutions, is one of the largest in the scale of the country. It is a huge challenge for us. And so the back office services and their security, first of all, and then a strong demand from our clients to offer digital solutions, digital services that are safe, that are secure, that are contactless. In the time of pandemic, crucial thing. So, for example, we have implemented a service that allows you to receive a letter sent traditionally in a digital form. And if you want something like that, you can ask us. We are providing the mailbox. We are changing the traditional letter on its electronic form. So, of course, it is extremely important to be sure that all the letters or the packages are safe. We have to deal with ADAS regulations, so we have to deal with safety and integrity, security. We have to deal with data stamping, and it is an important thing. And we are preparing for the role of national digital operator next year in Poland. The parliament is working on special act. We see a lot of changes, and as an institution with a 5 centuries history, now we have to really be a part of digital revolution, because besides the digital world, there is no market to play on, probably. Back to you, Sam.
Yeah, absolutely. And actually, one of the most interesting developments in Poland at the moment has been where the country stands on 5G, and it's adopted a robust position with regards to cybersecurity standards. And I just wanted to bring in Melissa here for her take on perhaps the risks that emerge in Europe pursuing its technological benchmarks and developmental benchmarks too rapidly. And in this context, let's remember that this week in Brussels, of course, we have the European Council Summit, and leaders are expected to adopt conclusions calling for a rapid deployment of 5G technologies in Europe. Now, you may recall, for those of you who follow the telecoms debate, that in 2016, the Commission adopted an action plan on 5G, which said essentially that every member state will have rolled out 5G by the end of 2020. That looks now to have been delayed by various, owing to geopolitical factors, but also the coronavirus crisis generally. Melissa, I would like you to maybe give us a bit of an insight into the risks that emerge from too much of a rapid pursuance of our technological benchmarks, particularly in the 5G space.
Sure, thank you, Sam. Well, I think that largely right now, our discussion about what's going on with 5G has been centered around the 5 key technology providers. As you know, you have 2 European champions delivering 5G equipment, Ericsson from Sweden and Nokia from Finland. But the company that has the largest market share around the world that has been supported through price subsidization and the like is Huawei, followed by ZTE, and then Samsung is the last technology provider. So we've been really focused on, at a geopolitical perspective, on the equipment could provide access to our data, and the 5G network is quite different because there's no longer going to be a separation between the data storage in the center, as like what people would say the core, versus the edge, where all of those devices are actually moving data, can store data, et cetera. So we're basically creating a more integrated and entangled network with 5G. So when I listen to how the port of Rotterdam is going to embed 5G technology to allow for better tracking of the shipping containers and movement of product to market, or I listen to the big industrials, the Dex 40 from Germany, how they've bought their own 5G licenses for their industries to create more efficiency and productivity and really to drive down costs. I don't hear the conversation about all of these edge devices that are connecting to the network. How are we going to build security into them? And because I look at this as all I have to do now is to take down the port of Rotterdam is to get into some of these edge devices that are going to be vulnerable, that bring me into the broader network of things. And I think that we're not having the resilience conversation embedded with the safety and security conversation as we're moving out in 5G. I do think that 5G is important and is going to enable a lot of transformational aspects of our industries and to society. And telemedicine and other things are right at the forefront that we're needing right now for COVID. But we have to, at the capitals, we have to, at the corporate leaders, have a responsible conversation as we deploy this technology. How are we going to maintain citizen safety? How are we going to maintain the resilience of our critical industries and citizen-facing services? And how are we strategically not making our countries more vulnerable to nation-state or criminal attacks? Those are the questions that must be addressed at the highest levels of our corporations and of our governments. And I don't hear that conversation happening around the world. Over to you, Samuel.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Marco, I'd like to bring you in here because the 5G debate has been incredibly divisive in Germany, and particularly in the CDU, where the party appears to have been somewhat split on their approach to working with certain Chinese suppliers. I just wondered, what are the risks of Europe adopting a fragmented approach to 5G cybersecurity? Of course, we've seen the European Commission put out their toolbox earlier in the year, and there is a move towards a greater harmonization, but it strikes me as certain member states are adopting very, very different approaches. And is this a risk for our general cybersecurity landscape in the telecommunications world? Marco.
Yes, thank you. I think you're perfectly right that if we have not established a cohesive approach to all these questions, then there is a lot at risk. But that's not only 5G and 6G and the providers that we are going to use in the networks of the future. I think it's more this COVID-19 pandemic has been a catalyst for all these discussions we are having here right now and in the political debate. And Melissa, forgive me, I wouldn't subscribe to that point of view that this debate is not happening. It's happening in the member states, and it's happening at the European Commission level and at the European Council level too. It's just that we are still 27 different voices with 27 different national policies, and it takes quite a while to make these mend these together and to kind of channel some cohesive approach out of these questions. So I see the debate happening, and it has some very impactful results here. First and foremost, if you have seen for example, the data strategy of the European Commission, then they address all these questions in a very cohesive way. And if you see national strategies like the one in France that I know and the German ones that I know perfectly well, then we are addressing these questions. But what we need first, before we can have these conversations in Europe in a meaningful way, is we need to fulfill the promise of the digital single market. Because this is one of the biggest obstacles to find a cohesive approach, is that the digital single market is not yet fulfilled. And I see European governments and the European Commission and the Council on a good way to fulfill this here. There's a lot of things coming in the next year. There is the Data Act of the European Commission. Then there is a strategic debate about 5G, 6G, microelectronics and cloud. You see the 15th of October, the Telecommunications Council will address this too. So I think we're on a good way. We are lagging behind, of course. I perfectly agree to that, and we need to step our game up, especially when it comes to these base technologies. But I'm actually hopeful that if you would forgive me, one of the good effects of this pandemic is that, as I said, it's very high on the agenda. Everybody knows that they need to address this, but as I said in the first question, there is other large issues that need to be addressed now too, and this is the economy as a whole. So I see good progress, and we're going in the right direction, but it takes a while, and I hope we go into 2021 with a cohesive approach.
Absolutely, and it's interesting actually to hear your remarks, Marco, on how certain geopolitical divisions could have an impact on our cybersecurity resilience and a more harmonized approach.
Samuel, Vangelis here, if I may.
Yes. I was just going to ask to bring you in, Evangelos. You've been working on 5G directly as part of ENISA. What can you tell us about the compliance, maybe, of member states with the 5G toolbox? And maybe you'd like to respond to Melissa and Marco there as well.
Yeah, what I would like to say is that Europe, obviously decided to follow a coordinated approach, which is not easy, as Marco explained. We are actually 27 countries that has its own, sensitivities and interests and, national security perspectives as well. So, but still, the European Union, the Commission decided, to follow a coordinated approach. And for that reason, we came up with the national cybersecurity risk assessments for 5G, and then the consolidated risk assessment that we have published basically last year around this time, so early October. And then we came up with a toolbox. And as a result of the toolbox, we have identified several, technical measures, which actually strategic and technical measures that can help, basically member states and operators to mitigate risks. And obviously, we followed up, and we have published recently another report about the status of affairs. Of course, this doesn't mean that the member states do not have the flexibility to deal with the topic, and they can take their own measures. They can customize them and find the right mix. But still, I will say that we all move towards a particular direction. In our approach, there is no particular, we don't somehow prohibit a particular nation or a particular vendor, to operate in Europe, not at all, but they have to comply with the European rules, with the European approach, which is very technical, very objective, very specific, and deals with arises from a risk assessment that has been done, at different levels of abstraction. So yes, there is a small delay, but we are all do our best. And of course, COVID came, to introduce an additional delay. But we are optimistic, that very soon we are going to see some hybrid 4G, 5G, pilots and services, coming up in Europe soon. So back to you, Samuel.
But I just wanted to press you a bit more on the fragmentation point. As part of the research being done by ENISA at the moment, how much fragmentation are you seeing across the EU in terms of our 5G targets?
Yes. Look, I wouldn't call it a fragmentation. I will call it, the ability of a member state, to use the right mix of tools. That was actually the logic of the toolbox. It's a box of tools, and people can use the tools, at their own, in their own way. And in my opinion, of course, that will result, in different implementation and different interpretations of the measures. I wouldn't call this a fragmentation. I will call it a variety. I will call it, an ability to flexibility. I will call it a way, to mix the measures in such a way so that you end up, with the right level of security. And we are optimistic at the end that, all countries will do their best, to protect their national interests and make sure that indeed, as Melissa said, are going to protect our critical infrastructure, and critical services, because this is going to be a very important underlying technical infrastructure. Back to you, Samuel.
So, Samuel, if Melissa, I could come in. So I think this is where our national interests are being driven by the economics, and especially with our gross national product being retracted because of COVID. There's a contraction here in the United States by 10 to 12%, and in other countries as much as 25%. So this is now where the debate comes in about the technologies and the cost of the technologies and the geopolitical standpoint. When you get a pretty good, I would say the Huawei product is a good product, but it comes with a subsidization from the Chinese government and is coming in at sometimes 40% less cost than Ericsson and Nokia. So that price subsidization is sort of a predatory pricing that's knocking out the European national champions from an economic decision of how do I quickly deploy 5G to get my economic opportunity on the plate. And many times, some of our countries are making the decision that I'm not worried about the national security risk from a Chinese company or from China writ large. And so this is where some of the tension is coming in, that we have to collectively address the predatory pricing, collectively understand the risk from the Chinese government compelling one of their national champions to collect data, et cetera, or divert data. But at the same time, we have to have a national and or industrial conversation about the edge devices, because these also, a Nokia, a Cisco, an Ericsson, are talking about how good this is for industries of adopting the 5G technology. And then we'll worry about security and resilience later. And that's unacceptable, because we've already living with too much risk from our software and hardware today. Patch Tuesday leads to Vulnerable Wednesday. And right now, our infrastructures are under attack. So when we make them even more proliferated with vulnerable products, where I can get access to a broader set of our networks and infrastructures through 5G, we must instill a higher standard on our products at the edge.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that's an interesting. May I add to that?
Please, yeah.
Thank you. I subscribe to these things, but there's one thing I want to mention. It's not only that we rob our national telecommunications providers of opportunities if we don't roll out 5G fast enough. It's that we rob ourselves of the opportunity to bring services that are competitive to the market for the next 2 years if we postpone this rollout for 2 years. So I just want to make sure that from a political decision-making standpoint, it's not only about the companies that provide technical infrastructure, it's about all these services that rely on the technical infrastructure too. So from a political standpoint, from an economical standpoint, this needs to be taken into account too.
Yeah, absolutely. And I actually think this is a good opportunity to bring in Thomas and Michael again when we're having this discussion about the difficulty of balancing innovation with cybersecurity objectives. What do you prioritize in terms of your business practices and the products that you bring out both in the banking sector but also in the postal sector? What is the first thing that comes to mind? Are you trying to innovate first, or are you thinking of the cybersecurity necessities before that you pursue that path of innovation? Perhaps we could turn to Michael first and then Thomas after.
No, thank you, Samuel. I think it would be probably quite realistic to admit that every single discussion around security requires a business push to go a certain direction first, right? It's not that we want to secure solutions that don't exist or don't make sense from a business perspective. It's actually quite contrary, right? The moment we understand that there's a certain product that we need to roll out, or if there's a certain service that will become core to our clients and we need to have it on the market, then it becomes a conversation of how do we make sure we do this at a risk point that's actually acceptable and within the appetite for our firm.
Absolutely. And from your perspective, Thomas, what normally comes first in terms of your consideration of innovation or cybersecurity standards? And what position do you adopt in terms of maybe working with some of these more geopolitically risque firms?
If you allow me, I will go a little bit back to the discussion on 5G, which is a good example, and money. I actually do agree that it is not only a money issue or an income issue. If we do agree that we more and more depend on technologies, we have to agree that it is obvious that money has nationality and technology has its nationality. It is important to be aware who owns technologies that we depend on. So actually, I have to say that personally, I strongly believe in the concept of digital sovereignty, but it can be understood in many ways. In the widest way, it is connected with creating technologies together with like-minded countries, with the allies generally, then creating them by yourself in the country, in the national way, and then the most narrow understanding of digital sovereignty, for example, from the perspective of such a large company as the one that I'm managing now, is to create technologies by yourself inside the company, to be the only owner and creator of the technology, and it can be implemented. This way of thinking, it can be implemented in all the discussions, and I guess that in Poland it is also connected with 5G. That's why we are after signing our MOU with the United States, for example.
Absolutely, and it's interesting that you make this parallel between ownership and trust. So the idea that maybe our ownership of a particular technology would therefore naturally lead to an implicit trust from citizens. And of course, we're seeing Europe make progress in this area with regards to its objective of digital sovereignty that Commission President von der Leyen outlined at the start of her mandate. And one of the perhaps columns of that would be the EU's data strategy, of which I know Marco's been heavily involved in, at least from the German perspective. So Marco, maybe you could tell us a bit about what Europe is doing in the data space and how this could give us more of a sense of technological sovereignty with regards to how we liberalise a market that traditionally in Europe has been ring-fenced in terms of personal data?
Yes, gladly so. The data strategies that are going on all over Europe right now, it's like an AI strategy. I think every national government right now has an AI strategy or is working on one. But the data strategy of the European Commission is hugely important because it channels all these things into one larger, under one larger goal. And this is to make data accessible in Europe, but make it in a trustful way. And I think this digitally, what we need actually in Europe, because we are lacking this kind of technological hotspot like Shenzhen or, for example, the Bay Area or Silicon Valley, is we need a digital ecosystem. We will not be able to put an ecosystem up in a physical way in Europe because the German government obviously wants it to be in Berlin or maybe Munich, but the French government, they will say, oh, this needs to be in Paris. And the Polish probably say it needs to be in Warsaw. So in the end, we will not be able to make it in a physical way. So what we need is a digital ecosystem that makes possible that innovative ideas, bright minds, intelligent people, and the sufficient funding and venture capital come together to forge this new innovative data and AI-driven services. So for that, we are working on cohesive and federated infrastructure. You might have heard of the project Gaia X, but the data strategy addresses these ecosystems in a very direct way. First and foremost, because the Commission wants to address a clear regulation on data spaces and what's allowed and what should be done and could be done and what is allowed within them. And the second thing is the Cloud Federation that you might have heard of. We will see some huge step forward in these data strategies and in these data-driven cooperations in the near future. But in the end, we need this ecosystem because this ecosystem fulfills one big promise. European ideas, European applications, European services, and European business when it's data reliant will only be successful not only if it's based on regulation, it needs to be a good, perfectly competitive and well thought out product. It needs to be a success story by itself. And then if it's relying on European values, it will be a worldwide success story. And this is how you kind of export trust, how you export data protection is you make a good business and then you base it on our idea of data protection, and then we can set actually kind of an example for the world, but it will not work if we only have the regulation part and we'll miss the innovative part.
Absolutely. And I wonder, actually, it would be interesting to get the cybersecurity perspective on the EU's data strategy. So I just wanted to turn to you, Evangelos, quickly. So obviously the European Commission has plans to create these 9 sectoral data spaces that will be able to communicate with one another, and we're attempting to liberalise our data economy in such a way that we have never ever done before. In your perspective, and coming from the position of ENISA, what are the cybersecurity risks that we have to take into account of greater data sharing in the European Union?
Yeah, so basically data is the blood of all services, of all systems, you know. So we produce, we generate data, we consume data on a daily basis, and it's a prerequisite, you know, for everything. So sharing the data is basically important, but you know, sharing data is not easy, and there are personal data where there are very privacy related data, for example, where you have very strict you know, rules and constraints and requirements imposed by GDPR. Then you have data which are, you know, sensitive data where they need to be protected, and classified data, for example, and so on, and more open data, you know, that we can use for in social media and others. So sharing the data basically requires obviously a very good definition of access rights, who has access rights, you know, who is able, you know, to use this data, if there are IPRs related to the data, and obviously what will be, the value added created, by this data, and if there are any royalties to be paid and so on. So because this is a very profitable business, and using the data can generate basically a lot of business opportunities, like for example the Google Maps or other kinds of value added services. Obviously sharing the data is important. I give an example, for example, with cars, sharing data about the status of the car, about the technical details of the car can help manufacturers and others to offer value added service. So in my opinion, this is very important to do this, to offer the opportunity, but at the same time you have to consider the challenges, the technical challenges. So for example, if a car is running and there are some data stored in the car and you want to access them in real time, that might not be easy. So if somebody manipulates the data or has access from this part to other more sensitive parts of the car and can break the car, stop the car, whatever, that might be very, very dangerous. So we have to be careful with this matter. So overall, yes, there should be a liberalization on these matters. There should be a proper regulatory framework put in place, but at the same time we have also to consider the security requirements. Also in terms of artificial intelligence, where Marco is coming from now, there are important elements to consider. So manipulating data might teach artificial intelligence algorithms the wrong way, and might develop habits which are catastrophic and might lead to decisions that the system will take in an intelligent way that might be very disastrous. So we have to be very, very careful and protect the data in the right way without prohibiting innovation, which is extremely important for our economies and for our societies. Back to you, Samuel.
And Melissa, I'd just like to turn to you quickly, and before we come to a close of this event, I'd like to remind our audience members that you can submit questions to us using the chat function on your platform. But Melissa, you come from a country that has had historically a very liberal data regime, but of course that has presented a lot of risks, political risks, risks to data protection. We saw the European Court of Justice only in July annul the EU-US Privacy Shield Agreement. What recommendation would you have to Europe in its wider efforts to liberalise the data space, and what opportunities are there for our critical sectors of making this liberalisation?
Well, that's a really good question. I think that one of the key things that we're going to have to deal with for the data governance writ large and kind of the content monitoring, content takedown is, I agree with all of the previous speakers that the free flow of data across borders enhances our competitiveness writ large and drives the digital economy. But we really need to get to the data management, the care, custody, and control, which is kind of what Schrems 2 overturn was addressing. But I think we have to answer 9 key questions. What data is collected and why? How and where is the data processed? Has data classification been established? How and where is the data stored? Because it gets to the geolocation pieces. How is the data protected? What is the data transfer policy? How long is the data retained and why? And how is data retired? But maybe the most important thing that's going to have to be addressed is who owns the data. Because it gets down to, we have fundamentally a belief that it is our personal data. But when another company, maybe it's our healthcare provider, collects it for helping improve our lives, and then they lose it, there's penalties associated with that, but it's almost as if they didn't have responsible care, custody, and control. So when I look at these different data centers and I look at the free flow of data, we need to start having a broader governance conversation about the collection, the storage, the ownership, et cetera. Now, just to level set, I'm not sure how, but we in the United States, we do have the California Consumer Protections Act, which is a data privacy protection regime that is on par, if actually more stringent, than your general data protection regulation, because it includes geolocation data and the like. It is extraterritorial, so it's anything that it's not just California, it affects all of the United States. I believe that's going to become the standard of care in the US, coupled with what has gone on with New York's Division of Financial Services that governs really the technology plane of companies collecting data. It requires the CEO and the board of directors to attest to the technical controls, the integrity of their systems. And so those two things actually are more stringent than what's going on in Europe. So I think that it's really important to I acknowledge that some things are happening in the United States that are starting to come up on par, or if not exceed the thresholds that you've set. But broadly, as collectively as countries and trading partners, the Transatlantic Alliance needs to get a much better grip over the data governance broadly, especially as one of our previous speakers said, it will drive and enhance our economic competitiveness and enable our digital economy. So it's even more important that we get to that regime quickly. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Over to you, Samuel.
Absolutely. And yeah, very interesting. Your point on the Privacy Act maybe acting as a standard for a broader federal data protection law in the US that would, I suppose, mobilize and allow for a greater innovative partnership and crossover of services between the EU and the US, maybe that have been damaged somewhat in the aftermath of the ECJ decision in July. We have run out of time, unfortunately. We've got no more questions coming in from the audience, but I'd just like to turn back to our panel and offer each of our speakers a 30-second closing statement on how they believe that COVID-19 has redefined critical sectors of our economies. And first, I would like to turn to Tomasz.
Thank you very much for the discussion. It was great. Thanks once again and congratulations to the organizers for dealing with such a spectacular event in this hard time. It is not easy to summarize anything after Melissa, which was great. And so the question is how the COVID changed the economy. So first of all, it did. Then the digital world, digital economy is boosting. We have to deal with that. Our role is to implement digital services in the most secure way that we are able to. Then I strongly believe and I do agree that the data ownership is important, as Melissa said, but I also think and I do believe that who owns the technology is important. So we have to use and create technologies with the trusted allies, with trusted companies, and along EU, along like-minded countries across the world to provide safe solutions for our clients.
Great. Thank you, Tomasz. An unsurprising Poland-US alliance there has emerged in our panel. Michael, I would like to turn to you for your 30-second summary, please.
Thank you, Samuel. Just trying to tie it all back into COVID and applying the cyber infosec perspective, I think we have to look at the beginning of the pandemic are pretty much things that are going to stay with us. For she's proven that things worked the way we changed them. So I guess it's just a new reality that we'll have to accept, and as we go forward, we'll probably need to even more so consider security and inception of every single service that we'll devise and make available. Obviously, infrastructure availability becomes key consideration, and it's not something we should anymore take for granted because we have seen how it suffers under the high demand and increased load. But at the same time, I think we also need to consider the fact that the broader population needs to really understand cyber risk from a sole consumer's perspective, so that everybody pretty much knows how to behave and how to take advantage of the digital offerings of our era. And from a purely corporate perspective, I think we've all learned a hefty dose. It was an exercise in flexibility, and I think this is just something that needs to remain with us as we go forward and approach and tackle problems to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Michael. Evangelos, super quick, your closing statement, quick.
Yes, look, I mean, for us working in IT, ICT, cybersecurity all these years, it's basically business as usual with an additional flexibility to work from home. And I believe that all the society are going, to benefit from our way of work. But at the same time, obviously, this opens up the Pandora box, to cyber attacks, vulnerability attacks, phishing attacks, all kinds of attacks. So we need to be aware. We need to invest more on cybersecurity. We need to understand the supply chain matters, understand, geopolitical matters, try to see where the whole thing goes, what is, all these campaigns, fake news campaigns and so on. So as a society, we need to better understand that all these digital services are helpful, but at the same time, generate problems, and we need to be aware of how we can address them if they pop up. So back to you, Samuel.
Great, thank you. Marco.
Yes, thank you. I see COVID-19 as a catalyst for the political debate. We need to take this momentum to forge a strategy that's bringing these 27 opinions in the European Union together. Then we need to underlie the strategy with bright ideas, innovative business models, and money, obviously, and the according regulation. And then in the third step, we need to establish the digital ecosystem within the European Union. And then I see us in the European Union and our international partners in an innovative, value-based, and bright future.
Great, thank you. And very quickly, Melissa, your closing statement, please.
I think it's essential as we accelerate our digital transformation as countries and companies that we design the architecture and embrace that enterprise with the thinking of not just the privacy of the data, but the safety and security of those services and systems, and then finally thinking about resilience. Right now, our infrastructures are under stress just for giving us availability. We cannot afford for their integrity to also be challenged and knocking us offline when we need to be online. I'd like to thank the Kosciuszko Institute and this Cybersec conference for including us and for really sparking this conversation. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Melissa. And thank you to all our panelists and the Kosciuszko Institute for staging this very dynamic and engaging discussion this afternoon. Apologies once again for the technical difficulties at the beginning, but hopefully as part of our digital transition and transformation in the future, these types of things will become less and less common, not without secure cybersecurity standards, I may add. Thank you once again for joining the debate, and stay with us for more panels and discussions throughout the day. Back over to the Cybersec team. Thank you.
Thank you, Samuel.
Thank you very much. And how did that ancient Chinese curse go? May you live in interesting times. Aren't the times interesting? Indeed they are. But this is where we are saying goodbye to the virus. And thank you to our discussants for sharing the knowledge and comments.